"You've always been the boring one," my brother said, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Honestly, you're dead weight. We'd all be better off if you just disappeared from this family." My parents laughed. Not nervous laughter. Not the kind where someone's uncomfortable and doesn't know what else to do. Real laughter. My mother even set down her wine glass so she wouldn't spill it. I kept eating. "My name is Wren. I'm 31 years old, a licensed occupational therapist, and for most of my adult life, I have been the financial backbone of a family that treated me like a piece of furniture they only noticed when something needed to be moved." We were sitting in my parents' dining room in Scottsdale, the one with the new kitchen I'd helped pay for after my father's contracting business had a bad quarter, which happened more often than anyone liked to admit. My older brother Seth was there with his wife. My parents sat at either end of the table, comfortable in the way that people are comfortable when they've never once had to worry about who's going to cover the shortfall. Seth had always been the one they pointed to. Loud. Charming. Perpetually between opportunities. He'd failed at a food truck business, a landscaping company, and, most recently, a cryptocurrency venture he'd convinced my father to co-sign a $40,000 personal loan for. The fact that I'd quietly wired my parents $15,000 6 months earlier to keep them from defaulting on their mortgage while that loan sat in collections. That was not brought up at dinner. "You're only here because we let you be here," my mother added, reaching for her glass again. "Don't forget that." I set my fork down. Not in anger. I want to be clear about that. There was no dramatic moment where something snapped. It was the opposite. Something went very still. The kind of still that comes after years of noise finally stops making sense. "Okay," I said. My father looked up. "Okay, what?" I folded my napkin, placed it on the table, stood up, and got my jacket from the hook by the door. I didn't slam anything. I didn't cry in the car. I drove home with the radio off, and when I got to my apartment, I made tea, sat on my couch, and pulled out the notebook I'd been keeping for the past 4 months. I'd started it in February after the last wire transfer, $30,200 to cover Seth's rent when his landlord threatened eviction. I'd done it automatically, the way you respond to a fire alarm, not because you want to, but because you've been conditioned to move. Sitting in my car outside the bank that afternoon, I'd thought, I don't even know why I did that. And then the worst thought, yes, you do. You did it because not doing it has never felt like an option. That night, I opened the notebook and I started writing everything down, not to be dramatic, not to be a case, just to see it clearly for the first time. The total, when I finally added it up, was $94,000 over 6 years. I didn't sleep much that night, but not because I was upset. I was making a list. The call started the next morning at 7:43 a.m., Seth first, because he always moved faster when money was involved. I let it go to voicemail, then my mother, then my father, then Seth again. By the time I was in the parking lot at work, there were 11 missed calls and a text from my mother that said, "Call us back. You're being childish." I saw 2 patients, ate lunch in my car, and called my attorney during my afternoon break. I'd started working with her 3 months earlier, quietly, carefully. She specialized in financial recovery, and more specifically in untangling people from the kinds of informal financial arrangements that families construct without paperwork, without agreements, without any acknowledgement that money transferred is not the same as money given. There were 3 things that needed to be addressed. First, the joint savings account I shared with my parents opened when I was 24, and they'd convinced me it was just in case, just practical, just family. Over time, it had become their emergency fund. My name was on it, which meant I was liable for what came out of it. I'd spoken to my bank already. The process to remove myself from that account was not simple, but it was possible, and I'd been quietly moving my direct deposit elsewhere for weeks. Second, the lease renewal my mother had me listed on as a co-applicant, the apartment Seth lived in. I had never understood how I'd ended up on that application. I had a memory of signing something during a holiday weekend 2 years ago, something my mother had called just a formality. It was not a formality. I was legally a co-signer on his lease. My attorney had already sent a letter to the property management company, and Seth had been formally notified that I would not be renewing. Third, and most quietly, I had changed my automatic recurring transfers, 3 separate ones, set up at different points over the past 4 years, each one born out of a different crisis. Monthly contributions to my parents' car insurance, a quarterly household support payment that had never once been questioned or thanked, and the standing transfer to Seth's phone plan because 3 years ago he'd lost his job and asked me to cover it just for a month. That last one had been running for 37 months. I didn't cancel them dramatically, I just set the end dates. Systems are clean that way. They don't require a conversation. Seth showed up at my clinic on a Thursday afternoon, which told me the transfers had already stopped processing. He walked into the waiting room in a gray hoodie and running shoes, pacing, jaw tight, and when the front desk called back to let me know, I stepped out to meet him in the parking lot because I wasn't going to let him make a scene in front of my patients. "What did you do?" he said. Not a question, really, more like an accusation looking for a shape. "I stopped," I said. "You can't just stop. I have bills." "I know, so do I." He stared at me like I'd answered in another language. "We're family." I'd heard that word wielded like a crowbar so many times that it had stopped having weight. "Yes," I said. "We are. You're gonna regret this." His voice dropped the way people's voices drop when they're scared and trying not to show it. "You think you're making a point, but all you're doing is hurting people who love you." I thought about the dinner table, the laughter, my mother not bothering to look up from her wine. "I'll take that risk," I said. He left. I went back inside and finished my afternoon. My father called at 6 p.m. that evening. No greeting, just his voice, flat and certain the way it always was when he thought the situation still favored him. "Transfer the money back." "No." "Wren, this is not a negotiation." "I agree," I said. "It's not." He told me I was destroying the family. He told me I was selfish. He used the word ungrateful twice, which I found interesting, because gratitude implies someone gave you something. What my family had given me mostly was the opportunity to give them things and then be criticized for how I did it. I hung up before he could finish his third point. The thing no one tells you about cutting off financial support to people who've depended on it for years is that the consequences don't arrive all at once. They arrive the way water damage does, slowly, then suddenly, and by the time you see the extent of it, the structure has already been compromised. Seth's lease cosigner notification sent the landlord a flag. Without a financially stable cosigner, Seth needed to qualify on his own, which he couldn't. He had 60 days to either find a new cosigner or find a new apartment. He did not tell our parents about this until he had to. My parents' car insurance lapsed on the 15th of the following month, when my automatic payments stopped and they hadn't noticed it was coming for me. My father discovered this when he got a notice from the DMV. He called me. I didn't answer. The phone plan took a little longer. Seth had apparently been paying the minimum on a credit card to cover it, not realizing the statement was set to go to an old email address. By the time he saw the overdue notice, it was already in collections. None of this was my fault. I want to say that clearly because there's a version of this story where I'm the one who caused the chaos. I didn't. I withdrew from chaos I was never supposed to be sustaining. The difference matters. About 6 weeks after the dinner, my parents hosted a Sunday brunch, the kind they always threw when they needed an audience for something. My aunt and uncle were there, 2 family friends, and Seth's wife. I was invited the night before, by text, the way you invite someone you're hoping will show up unprepared. I went anyway. I brought a fruit salad because I was raised right, and I sat down at the table and waited. My father stood up halfway through the meal, coffee cup in hand, and cleared his throat. "I think we all know there's been some tension lately," he said, "and I think we need to address the fact that Wren has decided, for whatever reason, to withdraw her support from this family without warning and without conversation." My aunt looked at me with an expression I recognized, not judgment but curiosity. She'd always been the quietest person in every room. Seth jumped in from across the table. "She just cut us off. No explanation. We're struggling because of her choices." His wife nodded on cue. My mother pressed her hand flat against the tablecloth. "We raised her to be part of this family, not to turn her back on it when things get difficult." The table was quiet. Someone's fork clanked against a plate. I reached into my bag. I brought a folder printed pages because some things should exist on paper where people have to actually look at them. "I'd like to share something," I said. My voice was steady. I practiced being steady for long enough that it wasn't even practice anymore, since we're talking about support and responsibility. I set the pages on the table. Bank transfer records, dates and amounts. 6 years of them, organized chronologically, with a purpose listed next to each one where I could remember it. Rent, loan repayment, insurance gap, legal fees. The $15,000 mortgage coverage in March 2 years ago, the one my father had never mentioned to anyone in this room. My aunt picked up one of the pages without being asked. Seth's wife stopped nodding. My father's face did something complicated. I'm not sharing this to be vindictive, I said. I'm sharing it because you told a story just now, and it was missing most of the facts. If we're going to have a conversation about what I owe this family, I'd like that conversation to include what I've already given it. No one laughed, not even nervously. I ate my fruit salad. I said goodbye to my aunt, who squeezed my hand at the door and didn't say anything, which was the most honest thing anyone did that day. That night I couldn't sleep, but not from guilt, from something closer to resolution. Not the cinematic kind, where everything becomes clear and peaceful and scored with strings. More like the feeling after you finally fixed a leak you've been putting towels under for years. The floor is still wet. There's still work to do, but the source is handled. I spent the next several weeks doing the work. The joint account took 2 in-person visits to the bank, a notarized form, and a conversation with a branch manager who was professional about it and didn't ask questions I didn't want to answer. I left that appointment and sat in my car for about 10 minutes, not crying, just breathing. The cosigner situation required one more letter from my attorney and a brief, unpleasant phone call with Seth, during which he accused me of trying to make him homeless. I told him I was trying to remove my legal liability from a lease I'd never agreed to be on. He said that was the same thing. I disagreed, and I said so, and then I let him be angry because there was nothing left for me to do about it. I also met with a CPA that month, not for anything dramatic. I just wanted someone to look at my finances from the outside and tell me where I actually stood. She went through everything, asked a few pointed questions, and when we were done, she said, "You've been running at a significant structural deficit for years. You're not in bad shape, but you should be in much better shape." I already knew that, but hearing it said plainly by someone with credentials, by someone who had no stake in the answer, that was different. I started putting $800 a month into a retirement account I'd been telling myself I'd fund when things settled down. Things had settled down. I funded it. Months passed. Seth called less. When he did, the entitlement had drained out of his voice and been replaced by something I hadn't heard from him before: real questions. How did I find my apartment? Did I know anything about renter's insurance? He'd gotten a new job, something in logistics, and he seemed embarrassed to ask me about the 401k enrollment form, but he asked anyway. I answered him, not because I owed him, but because I'm not cruel, and there's a version of my brother underneath all the conditioning who might still become someone worth knowing. My parents were harder. My father asked to meet in April. We sat at a diner near their house, neutral ground, which told me he'd thought about it. He looked older than I remembered, and smaller in the way that people get smaller when the things propping them up are gone. He ordered coffee and didn't touch it. "You blindsided us," he said. "I gave you 6 years of signals," I said. "You didn't think I'd ever stop, so you stopped looking for them." He was quiet for a long time. "We didn't think it was that serious," he finally said. "I know," I said. That was the problem. He didn't apologize. I hadn't come for an apology. I came because he was my father, and I'm still working out what that means now, when the transactional part of our relationship has been removed, and what's left is just 2 people who share a history and not much current real estate in each other's lives. We split the check. Evenly. He didn't fight me on it, which felt like its own kind of statement. I ran into my mother at the grocery store in May. I was in the produce section, and I saw her before she saw me, and I watched her for a moment. Just a woman, picking up a bag of oranges, looking tired. When she noticed me, her expression went through 3 things in quick succession: surprise, calculation, and then something I might have called grief if I were feeling generous. "You look good," she said. "Thank you," I said. She waited. There's a pause my mother has mastered over decades. A silence she leaves open, expectant, shaped exactly like an opportunity for someone else to fill it with an apology, or an offer, or a retreat. I'd been filling that pause my whole life without knowing it had a shape. I let it close on its own. "Take care of yourself," I said, and I put 2 bags of oranges in my cart and went to find the rest of what I'd come for. The last thing I did, the quietest thing, was delete the shared family folder from my Google Drive. It had been there for 4 years, a folder my mother had set up after my grandmother's estate was settled, supposedly to keep all the family documents in one place. In practice, it had become a dumping ground for things she wanted me to handle: lease paperwork, insurance documents, tax forms she didn't understand and didn't want to call anyone about. I downloaded what was legally mine. I deleted the rest. Then I closed my laptop, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat by the window and watched the streetlights come on one by one. There's a version of this story people want to hear where I'm triumphant, where the family falls apart and I rise above it, glowing and vindicated, maybe with a new apartment and a better wardrobe, and a standing brunch reservation with friends who appreciate me. And some of that is true. I did move apartments. Mine is quieter and the light is better in the morning, and I don't flinch when I check my bank account anymore. But the rest of it is more complicated than triumph. My father is getting older, and I don't know what happens when he needs real help, the kind that can't be handled by a wire transfer. My mother still doesn't understand what she did, and I've started to accept that she might never understand it, not in the way that would make a difference. Seth is somewhere in the middle, still becoming someone, and I'm still deciding how much of a front row seat I want to that. What I know is this: I was not useless to that family. I was, in fact, indispensable, and they'd built their whole understanding of me around the assumption that indispensable people don't leave. They were wrong about that. Not because I left to prove a point, but because staying was no longer something I was willing to do on their terms. And the moment I stopped, the moment I actually let myself stand on my own ground without one hand braced against their weight, I found out I'd been strong the whole time. I just hadn't been using it for myself. I still have the notebook. I don't look at it much anymore. But sometimes, when I need to remember why I made the choices I made, I open it to the first page. There's nothing profound written there, just a date and a number and a question I wrote at the top before I'd figured out anything else. Why do I keep doing this? I know the answer now, and more importantly, I know it isn't true anymore. I still think about that dinner sometimes. Not with anger. That part faded faster than I expected. What stays with me is the sound of my parents laughing. Easy laughter. The kind that meant they weren't afraid of consequences because they'd never had to face any. Not from me, anyway. What I've come to understand is that people don't treat you a certain way by accident. They treat you the way you've shown them is acceptable. For 6 years, I showed my family that I could be counted on without being counted, that I would give without being asked, absorb without complaining, and return without being welcomed. I taught them, through every transfer and every silence, that there was no cost to taking from me, so they kept taking. That wasn't cruelty exactly. It was just math. I'd made the math too easy for too long. Changing it required something I hadn't been taught to value in myself: clarity. Not the dramatic kind. Not a moment of fury where I flipped the table and declared myself done. Just the willingness to sit down with a notebook and a calculator and look at the actual numbers, the actual patterns, and ask myself an honest question. What would I tell a friend who showed me this? I knew the answer immediately. I just hadn't been willing to apply it to my own life. That's the part nobody talks about. It's not hard to recognize dysfunction in someone else's story. It's hard to recognize it in your own, because when you're inside it, it feels like love. It feels like loyalty. It feels like what good people do. And I am a good person. I know that now in a way I didn't before, because I proved it to myself not by giving more, but by finally refusing to give in ways that were destroying me. What my brother Seth is slowly learning, and I do believe he's learning it even if it's uncomfortable, is that real capability has to be built by the person who needs it. Nobody grows stronger by having someone else carry their weight indefinitely. The help I gave him for years didn't make him more stable. It made him less equipped to handle instability. That's on both of us. I enabled it as much as anyone, but only one of us can change what happens next. My father sat across from me at that diner in April and said he didn't think it was that serious. I believe him. I think that's the most honest thing he's ever said to me, and I think it's also the saddest, because what it means is that he never had to take it seriously. I'd made sure of that. I am 31 years old. I have a retirement account that's actually growing. I have an apartment where the light comes in right in the morning and nobody calls asking for money before 8 a.m. I have a job where I help people rebuild function they've lost, and I am good at it because I understand what it means to work quietly at something hard for a long time before anyone notices. I wasn't the dead weight, I was the foundation. And foundations don't disappear when they walk away, they just stop holding up buildings that were never grateful for the ground.